It is not uncommon to not relate to your family, yet the social narrative forces us to believe it is uncommon. Which family you were born into should not and does not dictate who you are. In an increasingly monotonous world where people are limited by their role of family and by their bond with their family members, people cannot truly belong in a community where they feel appreciated and where they feel they can be themselves. This is why we want faction-based association. 3 points of crucial setup from the get-go. First, in terms of factions and how they would be conducted, we would categorize people into certain groups based on their own interests and based on their own personal take on what they ought to believe in. We can take the parallel of the movie Divergent, where people in different factions come together to represent their own qualities and values that they believe in, such as bravery and communal happiness, where they would then devote their lives to that particular cause. They would basically bound by a communal interest. Secondly, the notion of family would still exist under our side of the house. We would just deprioritize the bond that is currently attached to them within the status quo. So for example, you would still be born into a family and understand the concept of family. Then you would separate and join a faction as you grow older. The point is, we don't want to place the same burden of family as we currently do within the status quo. Thirdly and finally, opposition has to defend the world of the status quo, where association by blood is the primary association instead of faction-based association. 2 arguments coming from the proposition. First, why familial bonds are not an accurate representation of belonging and why it's actually harmed. And secondly, why association by faction exclusively promotes cohesion and representation. First argument then, why familial bonds are not an accurate representation of belonging. The premise of this argument is simple. Familial bonds are extremely arbitrary. 2 reasons why. A, you don't get to pick what family you're born into. Objectively, the people who you consider family are ultimately strangers that society has placed immense emphasis and value towards. There's always a narrative to side and protect with your family, given the justification that simply these individuals are your family. There's often very little rationale to support further claims insubstantiated with this particular premise. But B, familial bonds often do not equate beautiful relationships or agreement that is intended with the narrative of family being like supportive of each other, right? Often there isn't necessarily cohesion or agreement between members of a particular family. Association implies that there ought to be some sort of unity that brings you together, such as your shared values, which ultimately often does not actually exist by association by blood, besides the fact that blood supposedly unites members of a particular family. This is because it overlooks the fact that some people do not have the utopic bond that is generally accepted to be the norm of family. This doesn't account for things like birth lottery. For example, you may be born into a family that's not necessarily ideal. In opposition, you have to stay with them. 3 reasons why this is problematic. First, you're taught the value of sacrifice from a very young age for the people you care for, i.e. your family in this case. This is inherently problematic because people often don't have the ability to make the choice of who they want to prioritize, whether it be people who they relate to and people who they actually share interests with and care about, or simply people who are characterized as family and are bound by in an arbitrary social construct. Secondly, family is seen to be the superior force that dictates your every action. For example, going against familial values is essentially akin to going against an entire cultural norm. I think the reason these disparities exist between family members in the first place is due to a lack of agreement, where some people don't necessarily agree with certain behavioral values that are instilled by family members and therefore want to rebel or go against them. This is barely allowed in the status quo. We can see things like emancipation that are often very, very frowned upon, despite people not necessarily knowing what may prompted that emancipation in the very first place, yet are very, very quick to judge these actions. Thirdly and finally, there's an opportunity cost of self-actualization, because in an environment where you don't feel comfortable in, oftentimes you can't express your true self. For example, you often limit your expression in an extremely conservative household where you cannot leave that situation. There's an active opportunity cost that you forgo in terms of being your true self and presenting this true self into a more diverse and accurate means rather than your family. This leads to 2 crucial impacts. First, you don't have any agency. You cannot choose whether or not you relate to your family and to what extent you're able to exercise the degree of relatability. You're essentially forced to associate yourself with your family irrespective of what family entails. For some, this could lead to a lower quality of life through things like bad mental health, for example, because people are forced to act or forced to behave a certain way that is in accordance with their family's values that are extremely emphasized. Secondly, this harms identity creation because people can't be their true selves. Gay people in conservative households, for example, are often shunned or sent to conversion therapy by their parents in order to follow certain religious traditions. This harms people to the extent that many still face condemnation and marginalization and are seen as sins and therefore are alienated by their own family, yet they cannot turn up against each other simply because they're bound by the social construct of family. Whereas under our side of the house, they would able to band with other members of the LGBTQ community, for example, by factions. Second argument then, why association by faction promotes cohesion and representation? The premise of this argument is that association by faction allows individuals to maximize their lives and find a more meaningful place in society in which they belong. 3 reasons why this is likely. First, the choice of what faction they join is ultimately up to the individual. The faction that you want to join is up to you and is likely to be based on the perspective you've developed over the course of your life. If opposition wants to say that values change a lot, I think that when this association by faction is likely to be adopted, then people would obviously realize its fluidity, meaning that there's much more room and much more ability to switch between factions. But even if that's not true, then at least there was an initial choice to side with a certain value rather than to have no choice at all, as is the case with families and blood association. Secondly, because individuals can actually choose who they want to be with and what side they want to be on, they can be more representative of their true identity. This means that there's a greater likelihood that society is able to belong with whom they see fit, simply because it creates a sense of pride in the faction that they've chosen. Thirdly, and finally, more comfortability suggests that you're more aware of the surroundings you're in, and you're more aware that you've chosen a particular environment. This means that you're much more likely to be able to express yourselves more fully and to a far more meaningful extent, exclusively under our side of the house. 3 reasons why this is important. First, a much more accurate representation of your identity is crucial because often identity concealment only leads to things like unhappiness and not being able to go further than you actually can, which is mitigated under propositions of the house because you will let go of this potential under opposition. Secondly, you get much more better catharsis for people who weren't previously able to express themselves. This is crucial, especially for minority groups who are often barred from self-expression and are forced to conform to the majority standards. Therefore, by allowing these individuals to band together in factions, we create a much stronger support system for these individuals to be able to advocate their issues and to be able to finally be heard. Thirdly and finally, in the long run, only we create better discussion hubs because there's greater umbrellas for who you could potentially side with. This means that discourse is much more likely to be enriched to understand the vast variety of perspectives and values that each faction holds and what they fight for. This especially affects children who are growing up and young teenagers who do not yet choose a faction because it promotes a sense of socialization where this discourse can help enrich these individuals' discussion-making processes and decision-making processes and give them access to knowledge from a very young age and expose them to the vast range of perspectives that exist in the current world to be able to give them the knowledge in order to choose the proper faction for them. Because we are the only side that gives individuals this meaningful choice to propose.